Here we are, another great World Affairs Council on the radio. This has become such a staple of Talkback, and we're always happy to have Bob Seidenschwartz in studio. Good morning, Bob.
Good morning, Peter. Good morning, John, and Missoula.
Good morning to you as well.
We have a special guest on the phone, Dominic Thomas. And Dominic, if you don't mind, I'm going to share a little bit of your bio here. So we'll do that right now. Dominic is the Madeleine L. Letessier Professor of French and Francophone Studies and Department Chair. He has a research at UCLA, by the way. Research interests include French politics, immigration, racism, globalization, European Union, and Francophone Africa. He has fellowships and residencies, a PhD of Yale, the William M. Scholl Foundation Chair in Romance Languages and Literatures, University of Notre Dame from 1996 to 2000. So we could go on, but we only have an hour. So, Dominic, welcome back to Missoula, sir.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, I want to share with the audience that Dominic has already been a guest in Missoula as part of the Southwest Asian Studies Conference that was here in Missoula in March. That's the annual conference that Mayor Daikia puts on. So I had the privilege of actually seeing a presentation by Dominic, and outstanding. So I feel very fortunate we have him here today. We have a short hour, so we'll get right to it. Dominic, let's talk about Brexit since we are in the 11th hour home stretch. The vote is tomorrow. The implications may or may not be major, depending on who you speak to. And no pun intended with the Prime Minister of England with major. I apologize for that. Couldn't help it. So, sir, could you please get to your thoughts on Brexit, and we'll delve right into it.
Great. Well, thanks again, Bob. I think, no matter what the outcome is, the impact of this referendum is going to be felt throughout the European Union, and one could even argue in a broader global context. Let's just go back a little bit in time. The UK has been a member of the European Union since 1973, which is actually quite late. It's over 20 years since the organization was initially founded as a trade partnership zone that involved only a handful of countries at the time. But current Prime Minister David Cameron, faced with a re-election campaign in 2015, made a strategic decision to announce to the electorate that we're growing increasingly concerned about the UK's membership in the European Union, that he would hold in the year to come a referendum on this question, in which the UK voters would be asked, should the UK remain a member of the EU or leave? And so the Brexit campaign, which is an amalgamation or a construct between the word Britain and exit, has been divided between two camps, the remain camp or the leave camp. And the vote on this will take place tomorrow. The broader context is, in fact, a power struggle within the Conservative Party that pits current Prime Minister David Cameron, who is in the remain in the European Union camp, against the former mayor of London, Boris Johnson, who is himself an elected member of Parliament for the Conservative Party and who is the leader of the Vote to Leave campaign. And so this is a power struggle within the political party, but also a broader opportunity for UK citizens to decide on their future in the European Union.
Go ahead. Dominic, quick question for you. Is the vote by the populace, is this binding, or is it going to have to come back to Parliament to make the final decision?
Essentially, there are going to be several stages. It's a majority versus minority vote. So all it takes is 50% plus one person to vote to leave the European Union, and a whole set of mechanisms will come into place. First of all, they will have to go to the European Union, and they have a time period in which they're able to do this. Article 50 of the European Union states that any member state may and they must notify the council, and then they have a 2-year period to negotiate the exit from that.
I've read a number of articles on this, and I've heard the case that if Britain leaves the European Union, it would be bad for Britain and bad for the European Union and bad for the United States. And I've also read if they choose to stay, it would be bad for Britain, bad for the European Union, and bad for the United States. Which side do you think is right?
The very fact that we're having a vote on this shows that it's bad for everybody, because no matter what the outcome is, the current sort of mental mindset that this vote reflects is actually the broader issue, and we'll probably get to that later in the show. I think that ultimately what you're reading is going to depend also on the sort of positions that have been at stake. So perhaps we could take a little bit of time to look at what are the leave arguments and what are the remain arguments. Essentially, when it comes to leaving the European Union, you have a sort of a position that Britain as an island closed off from its broader engagement with the European Union would be better off. So this is a sort of national identity sovereignty that's kind of put a wall up around the UK and we'll be a lot better off. There are arguments that sort of have to do with, low income, migration balances, cheaper labor coming from the European Union, and those kinds of things. And so much of the debate has been organized the question of immigration. On the other side of the Remain campaign would argue that the European Union is a major export zone for British products, that migrants contribute more to the economy than they take off, and that the net fiscal benefit is absolutely enormous for the UK. But ultimately, the arguments have a lot more to do with feelings and fears and a mindset than they often do with the actual concrete economic, political reality of being a member of the EU.
Let me ask the question, because the better or worse scenarios for both sides seem to run on two major themes, whether it's better socially for Britain or European Union or America, or whether it's better economically. And so I kind of want to just isolate the economic picture for a second, because obviously, what makes a Briton and what makes Europe a European, those are really big questions. But when it comes off to the economic benefits, do you think that the Remain has the stronger argument that the European Union has benefited Britain economically in a way that it couldn't be able to negotiate its own trade deals outside of the European Union's banner?
John, I want to point out, too, before Dominic answers that question, Britain exports 50% to the European Union. So this is a major trading partner.
But not 50% plus one, which is what it would need to do.
Such a wise guy. Dominic,
hang on, Dominic. We're up against a commercial break, Dominic. So hang on. We're going to get your answer here in a moment. We also have three lines open at 721-1290, and we will be right back on Talkback. Welcome back to Talkback, everybody. John King's over there. I'm Peter Christian. Bob Seidenschwartz joining us here in studio. And joining us on the phone, Dominic Thomas. And Dominic, we're beginning to talk more about the Brexit, as they're calling it. And we were right in the middle of answering John's question.
Yeah, it seems to me that a lot of it is over, social identity for the British people, and also about economics. And even the president came over to England to try to pitch his reason for why they should choose to remain in Brexit. So it's obviously got a lot of influence outside of those spheres, and I think a lot of that question is the economic question of how it affects everybody else economically. And so I guess my question for you is, if Britain chooses to leave, what will be the economic impacts for Britain and the countries that it trades with?
An important question, and of course, this has shaped much of the discussion that has taken place. So we can talk about that specifically, without forgetting the fact that there's other issues that are absolutely crucial to this. I think that when one looks at the broader European Union, there's a tremendous disparity between the 28 member states, and a lot of attention has been granted to countries like Greece and areas of southern Spain that have struggled with high unemployment figures, whereas the UK right now has a strong economy, about 5% unemployment. It's a very attractive destination for migrants. Now, the majority of leading economists have pointed out that the benefits to the EU of UK membership and the benefits to the UK of EU membership far outweigh the sorts of that the UK would find itself in were it to extricate itself from the European Union. So the Leave camp will argue that Britain is perfectly capable of arguing and of setting up trade partnerships with individual countries and so on. The fact is that belonging to a 28-member country space with over 500 million people, of being integrated into the major international trade and political summit as an EU member is an incredibly important negotiating tool. The European Union has provided stability for the British pound, for the British economy, and the UK has done extremely well from being a member of this particular space, as well as having this built-in structure of support of grants from the European Union, and of having a significant export zone in the area. So, of course, we don't know what would happen if the UK were to withdraw from the EU and what that landscape would look like. But all the evidence points to the fact that being a member of the European Union is a tremendous economic benefit to the island.
So, Dominic, along with that, one of the consequences would be, and the audience needs to understand, that Brits still use the pound, as opposed to
Absolutely. Right.
As opposed to
there are several things that make there are several things that have always made the UK a very particular member of the European Union. It refused to sign on to the Schengen border control mechanisms, which allow freedom of circulation in the European Union. So when you travel to Europe, you enter, let's say in France, you show your passport. If you decide to go the next day to Italy by train or by car, you don't have to show your passport again. But if you go over to the UK, you have to do that. The other thing which the UK did is not sign on to the common currency. So they continue to use the pound, whereas most other EU members use one currency, which is the euro, a currency which actually not all EU members have taken over right now, because there are certain admissions criteria into being able to use that currency. And you need to demonstrate a level of economic stability before that, quote, privilege is extended to you.
Was Britain economically wise to choose not to take the euro? Now, in retrospect, it seems like we should be able to answer that question.
Yes, I think that most economists would argue that the pound has done very well. It's a default currency with the dollar, the euro, and the pound. And in times of economic uncertainty, people have gone to the pound, away from the euro, or to the dollar, or away from the dollar. So the UK has done very well out of maintaining that currency, which has traditionally been much more powerful than the EU. And so the people in the UK, when they travel to mainland Europe, experience a significant bounce in the currency exchange, and one could argue a significant benefit in that particular context. What the pound doesn't like is uncertainty. And right now, for the past few years, there's been considerable uncertainty around this question of the referendum, which has weakened the pound and therefore weakened Britain's position in a global economic context. One should also argue that membership of the European Union has afforded the UK two particular advantages. On the one hand, being a major player in the European Union, and on the other hand, being a major Atlantic representative because of its privileged relationships with the United States. And as an isolated island, it would no longer have the kind of political clout that it previously held as a member of the European Union when it came to discussions over trade and economic policy.
So, Dominic, one of the things about the pound, too, I remember when they were negotiating the entry into the EU, is this was also a very strong nationalistic issue for the Brits in terms of hanging on to the pound. And it's been said by some that if this happens, in terms of the exit, the pound could drop anywhere from 15 to 20% overnight, which, of course, would be incredibly disruptive in the short term to equity markets and bond markets across on a global basis. So there's another part of this too I'd like you to address, which is the security issues of the EU as an organization. Brits exit, does this have implications from your perspective, from a general, broader security perspective?
Well, in a broader security perspective, there are, of course, all sorts of advantages of being a member of the European Union. The European Union member is not a state. If we just go back to the definition of it, it's simply a family of democratic nations committing to working together for peace and prosperity. It is not a state intended to replace states, nor is an organization just an organization of international cooperation. It's essentially a group of countries that have agreed to delegate a level of sovereignty and responsibility and hand it over to another organization. It takes care of justice, human rights, democratic institutions, and security. So the sharing of data, the sharing of information about the circulation of potential terrorists, of criminal gangs, of criminal organizations are all a benefit and an advantage to the UK as it currently stands as a member of the European Union. Now, of course, this would be the first time the country had left the European Union. We don't know the kinds of sort of deals and negotiations that would take place were they decide to vote to exit. And as we know today, all discussions around questions of security very much underscore the importance of sharing knowledge, sharing information, and so on. So I don't think one could imagine the European Union sort of cutting off the UK. It would be to nobody's advantage to doing that.
Right.
But I think that clearly being a member of that organization, sitting at the table and discussing and negotiating the future parameters of security is an important place to be. And it would be a great shame for the UK to not be at that table and to be a participant in that conversation.
Okay, Dominic, we're up against a break. We also have a caller online. And the question I wanted to ask, if we have the opportunity, is we've been talking about all of this from the perspective of the UK. And I'm wondering what benefit the European Union has of having the UK as a partner, and then what deficit would it be without it? So we're going to come right back with more of Talk Back in a moment. All right, we're staying. Should we stay or should we go? That should be the song that I should be using. All right, 721-1290 is our number. Joining us on the phone, Dominic Thomas. Dominic, where are you right now, by the way?
I'm in Los Angeles.
Oh, you're in L.A. All right, let's get Dave on the line. Dave, you're on with Dominic Thomas. Go ahead.
Yeah, good morning. About the European Union, in my view, it's halfway to being a good idea and halfway to being a bad idea. It is. If it was 50 individuals or 28 individual states, now with like the United States, it would be a good idea, or individual countries. But it's halfway in between. And Greece and weak countries like that are going to pull it down. In the United States, Louisiana and maybe Michigan are weak states, but it doesn't pull the whole system down because they work together to do the right thing for all the states. And so I think the European Union probably will fail unless they go either all the way to 28 states in a country or opposite.
Well, it sounds like you're kind of talking about the issue of federalism, right, Dave, a little bit? And you think what aspect of America's federalist system do you think that the EU should adopt?
Well, budgets. A national budget for all 28 states or countries. So if Greece is having a bad time, it doesn't have to lay off people and cut its budget to be balanced.
We have to do that in the States.
Yeah, do you understand, Dave, that...
But you got federal money coming in to compensate for it, unemployment insurance and what have you.
So does Greece.
Actually, that's how it's up for debate with Puerto Rico.
Right. Well, Puerto Rico is another one that should either be a state or an individual country. It can't be. You're in the middle.
Yeah, tell you what, let's let him answer that because we're running short on time. Thanks, Dave. So did you want to comment on what he said, Dominic?
Yeah, well, thanks, Dave. Yeah, it's a very interesting question. First of all, the definition of Europe itself is very complicated. Let's say it's got, roughly 50 countries. But Europe, because of its interesting colonial history, isn't restricted to what we think of as that sort of mainland area, circumscribed by, let's say, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and you sort of draw a circle going around. France has overseas territories in the Caribbean, in Latin America, in the Indian Ocean, and so on, as does Morocco. Spain has enclaves in mainland Morocco, and so on. But you're absolutely right. The question of who's in and who's out has always been a major problem from when it was created in 1952 with only 6 countries to expansion all the way up to the past couple of years to 28 countries. So now have over half of sort of what we might consider Europe as being a member. What is interesting about this, though, is actually that the situation of, say, you mentioned Louisiana or other states is very much at work in the European Union today. We saw this with all sorts of bailouts when it came to helping the Greek economy. We saw the European Union has stepped up in discussion of the migrants crisis by providing exceptional funding to areas that are particularly impacted by this, such as Greece and Italy, southern Spain, and so on. But we also see it on a daily basis through agricultural subsidies, through subsidies for fisheries, for the redistribution of agricultural products, and so on. So it's actually at that particular level, one could argue, is where the European Union has worked exceptionally well. Where it has worked less well is in promoting the idea of what it actually means to be a member of the European Union and promoting the idea of belonging to that entity that is called the EU.
With that, Dominic, we need to take a break. We're going to come back in 6 minutes and continue this discussion. Stay with us. Welcome back to Talkback, brought to you by AAA. AAA pays for itself with discounts on big brands. Join now. Get a free canvas tote. Visit AAA.com/Montana. Selway Armory on Stockyard Road. More guns and ammo than anyone in Missoula. Montana's premier firearms dealer. Transport Equipment, your headquarters for RV service, maintenance, and repair, located next to the Axeman. Diggett Excavating, bringing 30 years of excellence to every job, 214-4292. And Kootenai Creek Village, the maintenance-free active adult community in Stevensville with the best of Western Montana living. Okay, we are back on Talk Back. It's the Montana World Affairs Council on the radio. Bob Seidenschwartz is here. John King. I'm Peter Christian. Dominic Thomas joining us from Los Angeles, and we're talking about what's going on in the UK with the Brexit, if you will.
Peter, did you have a question about the Scotch-Irish?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you if this may sound like a Dr. Obvious question, but are the people in Scotland and Ireland involved in this vote as well?
Right. They're, the folks, they're going to get to weigh in on that as well, and it's interesting to kind of see, who's going to, how the sort of differences work out nationally in terms of overwhelming, in terms of support for the, the Remain or the Stay or the Exit versus the No vote, and then how that works in that particular context. But yes, it's a broad United Kingdom-wide vote that will be folks that will be involved in that,
We have a question from our Facebook page. It's from Katie. She says, Marine Le Pen is supporting Brexit and is, in fact, putting together what is being called Frexit, a movement for France to also leave the EU. In addition, Switzerland has withdrawn its application for EU membership. All of this indicates a growing rejection of the overreach of Brussels' globalist architects in favor of a nationalist agenda. What, in your opinion, is the most likely outcome of the contest between globalism and nationalism?
That's a really, really great question Katie poses, because, of course, this debate and this discussion is not restricted to the United Kingdom. There are several European Union member countries right now whose leaders are under pressure to explore a referendum. And France, of course, with the elections coming up in 2017 and the rising popularity of the far-right party led by Marine Le Pen is one of them, as is indeed Italy, Sweden, and a few other areas that have been calling for a similar kind of referendum and for revisiting this question. If I could perhaps answer that in a very quick way, there is a tremendous similarity between the ways in which the American electoral season has been talking about and using the word Washington for all that represents in terms of the establishment and power and money and corruption, and the ways in which many people in Europe talk about this sort of big brother-like figure that is Brussels that is associated with being this kind of establishment entity that is coming in and controlling your country and taking away your sovereignty and so on. And that might be a good way to think about the parallels between the two and the ways in which that debate has worked itself out.
So,
go ahead.
Dominic, there's, as you're pointing out, very interesting parallels with our election here and Europe, because in Europe economically, you're seeing very similar types of decoupling where the rich are getting richer, those who are in the lower income brackets maintain kind of that status, and the middle class is losing ground and is also the right is the benefactor of that middle class losing ground. So you see you see strong similarities politically.
And when you look at the statistics, the research that's been done by, The Economist, The Guardian, BBC, and other research organizations, you see very similar kind of breakdowns. The richer you are, the more likely you are to vote to remain. The poorer you are, to leave. If you're living in sort of some of the northern areas of Britain, some of the former industrial areas that are a little poorer, you're seeing a greater inclination to vote for leaving, whereas in the more prosperous south is to remain in the European Union. You get similar breakdowns between the young and the old and along party lines, in which the more to the right you move, the more likely you are to vote to leave, precisely because of sovereignty, national identity, immigration issues, and those sorts of questions.
So let's talk about the migration issue, because this we're touching on all of this at this moment in terms of what being discussed. So please touch on the migration, because it seems to be, from my perspective, a significant driver economically and emotionally for what is moving Europe right now.
It is absolutely the case. Let's just start off with Britain. And I mentioned her today in the most symbolic way, because Jo Cox, a 42-year-old woman who would have celebrated her birthday today, who is an elected member of party for the Labour Party for the West Yorkshire region of the UK, was killed. And I think the overwhelming evidence points to the fact that she was killed, murdered, because of her political views, because of her outspoken views on the question of migration, on her vision of Britain as being a diverse entity, as a member of the European Union, by somebody who claimed in court just the other day, death to traitors, freedom for Britain. You have UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, whose posters have talked about the fact of used words like breaking point and how the EU has failed us. We must break away and take back control of our country. This debate has been shaped by the question of immigration for years now, about what it is to be British, so this sort of emotional, fear-driven, easily manipulated kind of entities, and then the realities that go along with that. And you see this being replicated in debates in Germany, in the recent elections in Austria, and most certainly in France with the 2017 elections coming up that are essentially organized around the question of national identity, immigration, and the migrant crisis in Europe. What does it mean to be European? Who is a member of this particular club? And can Europe protect us in a way, or should we go back to a kind of sovereign national identity kind of paradigm?
Okay, we're up against a break, Dominic. We also have Alan on the line who wants to visit. I know John and Bob are both brimming with questions as well. And we only have you for another 20 minutes, so we will try to make the most of that time. We'll be right back. We're back on Talk Back. Oh, I'm just glad the cameras aren't on it here. It's pretty disgusting. What can I tell you? Dominic Thomas joining us this morning from L.A. We're talking about what's going on in Great Britain and the European Union. And let's get our caller. We're trying to put our callers first. Alan, you are on with Mr. Thomas. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning. I'm curious. What does it cost the British people to be a member of the European Union? And how are each member state taxed, or how do they fund the European Union?
It was like a club, but what are the dues?
Well, that's a tough one to go into it. I'm not sure I'm equipped to fully answer that. Having said that, it depends very much on first of all, the size of the country, right? So the same as it goes to dividing up votes. Germany gets the most votes. Then countries like France and the UK are divided up. So it's very much a kind of membership driven by one's overall population. When it comes to Britain, estimates are that it's somewhere in the billions of pounds sterling, which they contribute to that particular entity. When it comes to assessing, the cost benefits, which would be, of course, any sort of, rational sort of economic decision would be made there. The benefits of paying that membership are far greater. It would be sort of like contributing to a meal plan at a country club. You wouldn't contribute if the overall was a sort of an enormous loss to you. So the benefits far outstrip what the particular costs are. It's of course an argument that's made by the Leave campaign that this would be a way of saving money and being able to put it back into the economy and so on. But as we were talking about earlier about the sort of the overall benefits, one only has to go back to the end of the Second World War and to look at the state that the European zone found itself in, countries that were so devastated by the Second World War, and the tremendous growth in standards of living, GDP and so on of European countries really serves as sort of total confirmation as to the success of the experiment. There have been some bumps along the way, there have been some issues along the way, but overwhelmingly people living in the European zone enjoy a standard of living that is almost unparalleled anywhere else in the world.
One of the things that they have to give up, right, to join into the European Union is sovereignty over a bunch of different types of decisions. Whether it comes to how various ways of they might protect their industries, various ways that they might trade in different avenues. What are some of the flashpoints on that end, on the sovereignty front?
Well, on the sovereignty front, I mean, it's interesting, when it comes to the UK, which I think still continues to point to the fact that this is a kind of fear emotion-driven debate, because the basic fact is that two of the sort of major areas, one of them being currency, don't involve the UK because they held on to the pound sterling, so they don't have to worry about fluctuations in the euro and so on in the way that, say, France, Italy, or Germany may have to. And the second thing is they maintain border control. The UK authorities control who gets into the UK and who gets to leave the UK. Now, where that breaks down, of course, a little bit is that as a member of the European Union, the 27 other countries have a right to circulate, which means that they have a right to enter the UK without a visa and seek employment. What the Leave camp would argue is that they would like to have greater control over that. They would like to have stricter regulations attached, a kind of green card scheme that would apply, because right now they have a scheme, a selection point system that applies to migrants or people coming in from non-EU countries. What many people would like to see would be that scheme applied to people that are coming into the UK from the EU zone, and that represent about half of the net balance of about 330,000 a year that come into the United Kingdom.
So, Dominic, really, this goes to the heart of the issue that I think is driving so much of this, which is the migration is coming from North Africa, it's coming from the Middle East. And we're talking about people that, correct me if I'm wrong, are predominantly, in terms of their religious background, Muslim, and culturally extremely different than the European countries that they're going to. Could you please talk about what the problems have been in terms of this mass migration and integrating people into these countries? And at some point, when do you become a Frenchman, or when do you become a German, or is that not the case?
Right. Well, that's taken very differently. Of course, the whole question is that the European Union has a council that specifically addresses question of migration. So you're talking about third party. You're talking about people that are entering the European Union from areas of the world that are not members of the European Union. So there's a level of migratory control that takes place at that particular level. First of all, it's important to situate this in a much greater, historical context. If you just take a country like France, about 30% of people living in France have a grandparent who is not French. So there's a very long history of migration, of people coming from other parts of the world, shaping a country like France, which in the 1920s had an immigration level that was about the same as that in the United States. But the fact is that this is today correlated with the question of national identity and of selectivity, because the majority of migrants today entering national spaces within the European Union are not coming to France, let's say, from Poland, Italy, or Spain, but are coming from areas of the world that, as you just mentioned, are primarily located in Africa, North and Sub-Saharan Africa, and in the Middle East. And with that comes changes in religious identity, family values, and so on and so forth. The question of integration has worked its way in different ways in different European countries, and this is where the problem gets very complicated. Very early on in the United Kingdom in the 1970s, they practiced an open policy of multiculturalism in which ethnic and religious identities and so on were recognized, whereas the French have not done that. So you could argue that the UK have been far more successful at the question of integration, of sort of racial incorporation and so on too. And what they're really focusing on is the question of migrants, which don't automatically come. Most people in Britain actually are talking today about the problems with the EU are about people coming from new member countries of the EU that are poorer. Bulgaria, Romania, from the Baltic states, whether Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, and so on. They're not automatically focused on people from what we might call the global south, Africa and the Middle East. That's a component, but it's not as much of a component. Whereas in a country like France, migration from these areas of the world, predominantly when it comes to the African continent, have to do with migrants that come from former colonial spaces. And France has done an appalling job of thinking about integration and diversity.
All right.
The far-right political party today, and its views have been mainstreamed by the right as well, its campaign logo is "This is our house," or "This is our home." So that today, people who are born in France, who might not be white, whose parents were born in France, still don't feel French.
Wow. All right, Taylor, let's get one call in before we have to take our break. Rick, you're on with Dominic Thomas. Go ahead.
All right, this is probably very stupid, but my question is, why do we, meaning the United States, care if they leave the Union or not?
Good question.
Okay, thanks for the call, Rick. Appreciate it. So, what do you think, Dominic? Tell you what, if you
That's
could
a
you
great
hang on,
question. It's a great
could you
question that connects up with
Dominic, hang on to that
with-
answer for just a second. We're up against a commercial break. I apologize for that. But it's a very good question, deserves a good long answer, and we'll be right back with that in just a moment. Okay, we're back on Talk Back, the Montana World Affairs Council on the radio. Dominic Thomas joining us. We're talking about what's going on in the European Union and Great Britain. And the question from Rick was, so what difference does it make to us? Whatever happens in Great Britain?
I think it matters a lot. I think that these kinds of debates, first of all, are interesting for American audiences to sort of see what's going on in Europe. How are debates on national identity, sovereignty, putting up walls, the establishment and so on, significant over there as they are shaping the U.S. electoral campaign. The first thing I would say is the UK leaving the European Union weakens the European Union. The European Union has been a significant ally economically, politically, socially, and culturally for the United States. So it would weaken that particular organization. As a trading partner, the UK and the European Union with the extended market that is implied that has been important. And secondly, the United States enjoys a very special relationship with the United Kingdom, and the UK's membership in the European Union gives the United States a voice with those 27 countries in a broader European landscape that it would not otherwise have. And I think those things are therefore, very important. The economic stability that comes with EU membership, the instability that would come from the EU exit would disproportionately impact all kinds of economic markets and so on in the United States. But I think the number one thing is that the EU is stronger with the UK being in it, and a stronger EU is an enormous benefit to the United States' economic and geopolitical strategic interest in that part of the world, which extends from the Atlantic Ocean down to the Mediterranean, all the way over to the Near and Middle East section of the world.
And we have a little trade pact called TTIP that is in the process of being negotiated between the European countries and the United States. So it does have a major impact in either passing or not, as you point out. Now, we just have a few minutes. Dominic, you recently have put out a book that is in French, and it is translated in English to its title as, and give us a little background on this, please.
Yeah, it's a book that was just published in France and essentially explores the notion of the war of identities. A lot of people are talking about a kind of a clash of civilization that would pit the West against the rest of the world. I think we look at things quite differently. We look at the questions in Europe today with the rise of the far right, the kinds of divisions that the Brexit debate has, that the elections in Austria, France, and elsewhere are doing, and actually are thinking a lot more about the idea of sort of what is this kind of problem that we're having? What is this war of identities and of mindsets that are destroying the fabric of these particular societies where people, on the one hand, feel that civilization is kind of under siege, that migration is transforming the parameters of society, and they're sort of looking to the past, so sort of, Europe was once great or France was one great, rather than focusing on the ways in which these countries have evolved, the tremendous benefits that are taking place in these particular areas, the ways in which diversity has worked out, the advances that have taken place in terms of human rights and women's rights and migrants' rights, and embracing this new kind of society. So after the attacks last year in Paris in January and November, French president and then the prime minister talked about the fact that we are at war. So we know that there's a war, but it's not a traditional Cold War where the enemy was easily identified. The enemy is both on the outside, but the enemy is also within. And I think that these societies are struggling to find responses, are struggling to kind of find ways of thinking about these particular issues and about defining the parameters of 21st century existence. And the sort of conclusions of this work is that ultimately right now, the question of terror is shaping these particular debates, and that people are absolutely, and in fact, terror, what we would argue, is winning out. Because one of the consequences and objectives of terror is to destabilize, to enhance fear, to destroy the social fabric and the kind of harmonious ways in which living had previously been in place, to attack the values of democracy and the fundamental principles of coexistence. And so what we're arguing for is greater entente, greater discussion to enhance the conversation about these kinds of things, rather than giving way to fear and uncertainty that the Brexit debate is absolutely exemplifies.
So you need to send this book, I would think, to Ms. Clinton and Mr. Trump.
Exactly.
Yes.
I think they'd have a lot to learn from this particular debate. And I think that the issues essentially that are being discussed in the U.S. today are not dissimilar to the sorts of issues that are shaping the political landscape in Europe today. They're about national identity. They're about what makes America great. They're about what the future looks like and about how we need to respond to the challenges that we face today in the 21st century.
I want to ask you something about the modern era. We have a lot of technology, and I think that maybe this sets us back. You know, back when I Love Lucy was the hit TV show, something like 70% of TV watchers watched it. It was a common social theme. Today, the hottest TV show gets maybe 14% of viewers. Do you think that technology and our ability to isolate ourselves is going to make it harder for social cohesion going forward?
That's the question and a topic for another show. I think that if anything, it has enhanced and improved our understanding of global problems. The fact that we do not live in isolated places, that we don't want to live hidden and barricaded behind walls. We want to look over the wall. We want to see what's going on the other side. You know, walls don't keep people out, I believe. Walls keep people in. We need to break down those walls. Technology helps with that. It helps to promote understanding. It helps to promote people's awareness of the trials and tribulations that people face in a broader international context. And I think that we all benefit from knowing what goes on the other side and from helping that shape and define our own identities and the ways in which we want to live.
So, Dominic, on behalf of the Montana World Affairs Council, John and Peter, it's been a pleasure to have you today, and you are welcome back anytime. And we also want to mention that you'll be coming to Montana probably more frequently, since you will have a son that will be going to, what's that town called, Peter?
I believe it's Bozeman.
We'll have to educate Dominic in terms of the clash of cultures that exist here in Montana.
That's it. It's a great state, and I love visiting it, and I look forward to being there a lot more and to having conversations with people about these difficult questions. Thank you.
Just teach your son to say "Go Grizz" in as many languages as possible.
Bobcats are clearly a weaker species than grizzly bear.
Thank you so much, Dominic.
Thank you, Dominic.
Thank you, folks. Have a great day.
Take care. All right, now we're going to take a break, and we have Montana Senator Steve Daines joining us. He's on the other line. We'll get to him in just a moment. Okay, a very, very busy morning here on Talkback this morning, the Montana World Affairs Council on the radio, and becoming more domestic now with Montana Senator Steve Daines joining us this morning. Steve, welcome, sir.
Hey, great to be with you.
Now, first of all, congratulations, I guess, are in order. We just had a major decision come down about fracking that came down in the favor of energy companies, right?
Well, it is. It's good news. It's great news, in fact, for Montana-made energy and for Montana-made jobs. This is another example of why it's important that the Obama administration's overregulation and their tyranny comes to an end. And it's yet one more court decision that's saying, Mr. Obama, you can't make laws with your phone and your pen. So this is good news for Montana. It's good news for our country.
Now, on that front, just yesterday you had a coal scoping hearing, and I was hoping you might be able to tell us a little bit about what some of the results were from that.
We did. Interesting how this all came about. What's happened here is the Department of Interior is touring around the country, receiving official comments, really, as they prepare the NEPA response here for this programmatic review of leasing energy on federal lands. Here's the absurd result from the Department of Interior. They skipped Montana in this scoping process. They skipped us. So they went to 6 states. They skipped Montana. They had a meeting in Seattle, Washington yesterday at the same time that we held our meeting. What we did is I intervened, and I said, we're going to have an official scoping meeting here in Montana. Here, contrast the state of Washington to Montana. Montana has more recoverable coal than any other state in the United States. Washington produces 0 coal, zero. So why in the world did they go to Seattle for a scoping meeting?
Better restaurants?
Because they other than they're Seahawks fans, I'm not sure. Maybe the Mariners were in town. I don't know.
More wineries, yeah.
The seafood is better in Seattle, I will say that.
Yeah.
But because they knew they were going to get very little resistance out there. You've got a much greener kind of environment wants to shut down Made in America energy. And here in Montana, it's going to directly affect us, thousands of jobs, our tax revenues, double-digit increases in our utility bills, resulting in the EPA power plant. So the bottom line is we held a scope meeting in Billings. We had, by 6-1, the comments were in support of our coal industry in Montana. And it was very important that the comments of Montana, that the voice of Montana is heard in Washington, D.C. And this is all of the official record. Every verbal comment made, every written comment will be part of the official record so that our voice got to be heard. They tried to skip us. I intervened and ensured that our voice is heard in this process.
Oh, I know that Secretary Sally Jewell was in Montana not too long ago. A lot of state officials were urging her to come out to visit Colstrip, and that never happened. And every time this seems to come up, then you brought it up yesterday, the fact that they weren't in Montana, that they were going to Washington. Do you feel like agencies like the Department of Interior, the BLM, which we think of as non-partisan bureaucracies, have leaned much harder in a partisan direction in recent years and are making it difficult for states that are on the other side of the fence on some of these issues to get a word in?
No doubt about it. It's interesting. In fact, we had a hearing yesterday on the Energy Committee, which I'm a part of. We had the director of the BLM in front of the committee. You take a look at a map of where the BLM lands are. As you head east out of Montana, once you get to the North Dakota border, if you were to draw a line north and south, starting at the Montana-North Dakota border, basically all the BLM lands, with the exception of a few little parcels of North Dakota and South Dakota, are all west of that line. You go to the eastern part of the United States, there's nothing out there relating to the BLM, no BLM lands. These are issues that affect the western states. My concern is that you've got these eastern bureaucrats who are seeking to impose their will on our way of life in Montana. We need to respect the states. I have strong federalism instincts, which means I stand for the rights of the states. That is really when our founding fathers put together the construct of the United States Senate. It was a primary vehicle to protect the rights of the states because every state got 2 senators. And so I take that responsibility very seriously. And as you said, we see a bias of these federal agencies, this overreach, that they seek to control our way of life in Montana. And that is a fight that we take every day in this job back in Washington, D.C.
Senator, when we started the show talking about fracking, can you please elaborate on what this decision was and what court did it come from? And just as an aside, the Saudis tried very hard to drive U.S. companies out of business. And to a degree, some did go out of business. But what recently has happened is due to technological innovation and the developments that have come from lower prices, we have actually become more efficient in driving down cost for extracting oil. So this hasn't worked very well as a strategy, and I think it goes and speaks to American ingenuity and technological innovation.
Bob, I could not say it better myself. I completely agree. This ruling came down from a district court judge in Wyoming, and what it did is it struck down the Obama administration's regulation of hydraulic fracturing on federal lands. We've had lengthy conversations in hearings in Washington looking at these redundancies, this overlap, where the states have very sound, robust, solid regulations in place on hydraulic fracturing that ensure that we protect our way of life, our lands, our water, and so forth in Montana, in places like Wyoming. Then the federal government is usurping, putting itself ahead of Montana, Wyoming for federal land, and it's putting another set of regulations in place that are adding no value other than just adds more bureaucracy and hinders our ability to make more made in Montana, more made in American energy. And Bob, as you said, in the last couple of years, the United States now has become the world's leading producer of oil and oil liquids. We surpassed Saudi Arabia and Russia in the last couple of years. We are now number one. That is a dramatic shift, and this has significant impacts not only for our economy, but also our national security. You know, a lot of folks are listening today remember what happened in 1973, the War of Yom Kippur, when oil prices spiked 4x in a period of 60 days. We had 55-mile-an-hour speed limits. We had gas rationing, even odd plates at the gas station. And those were in the days when we depended heavily on the Middle East for energy. The good news is today, thanks to American innovation, American ingenuity, free markets, that we have increased production, driven prices down. That's good for the American economy. It's very good for our national security, removing this dependence on the Middle East. The world will be a safer place when there's more made in America energy.
Speaking of free markets, one of our Facebook listeners, Matt, has a question for you. He says, isn't the coal industry more affected by natural gas than any regulation that has taken place? Isn't China's reduction in coal use a larger factor right now?
Well, a couple of things. It is true that lower natural gas prices are putting pressure on coal. Frankly, we've got low energy prices, whether it's oil, whether it's natural gas. We've just seen certainly a significant decrease in price because of the abundance, the increase in supply due to hydraulic fracturing. But it would not be accurate to suggest that the reason coal was struggling is primarily because of price. It is a combination of short-term price pressure from natural gas, but it is the uncertainty and the regulatory overreach of this president and the EPA, which is a significant driver here in what's happening in the coal industry. As I sit and chat with members from the Crow tribe, union members that depend on these jobs, it's this uncertainty and this overregulation that is having a devastating effect right now in the industry. You know, you look at what's going to happen in the next 25 years. We looked at projections at the energy conference that I held in Billings the end of March. Energy demand globally is going to go up 85% from where it is today in the world because we're adding 2 billion more people to the planet. And as economies continue to grow, economic demand continues to grow. So when you project out the next 25 years, what does the all of the above energy portfolio look like? It's going to include coal, natural gas, oil, wind, solar, hydro, and nuclear. But coal consumption 25 years from now, by many estimates, is not going to be necessarily down from where it is today. It's actually going to be up from where it is today as you see the Koreans, the Japanese, and the Chinese now investing in clean coal technology. The problem we've got now with this administration, they want to kill coal in America. And what that does, I think, not only does it create higher energy prices and loss of jobs, loss of tax revenues, and impacting our economy, but environmentally it's the wrong direction because we should have American innovators focused on clean coal technology, just like we saw happen with hydraulic fracturing with oil. It was American innovation that drove this. Let's let American innovation drive clean coal technology because by doing so, we'll lead the world with the Chinese in getting them on clean coal technology. And environmentally, we're better off if we're engaged in developing this technology than completely killing this industry. So I think there's a lot of reasons. We've talked about the economic reasons and for the purpose of low energy and reliable energy for base load, but there's an environmental argument to make around why we should stay engaged in coal and focus on innovation.
Yeah, we'll do that when we've got to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more with Senator Steve Daines. Stay with us. Talk back, and we have a very, very limited amount of time. Senator Steve Daines joining us here on the phone from his office in Washington, D.C.
One of the things that we really wanted to talk about today is the issue of forests and forest management. There is a video I have from last summer where I was driving around with my kids, and we took a park in the parking lot because we couldn't see the sky, couldn't see the sun in the middle of the day because there was so much smoke over here in Missoula. And, of course, there's so many timber jobs that have lost. And a lot of people think these things are related, that there could be a solution that helps solve our forest problems with the smoke and the fires and helps create jobs in the western part of the state. I was wondering if there's anything that you've been doing to work on that.
Well, all of us as Montanans now brace for the fire season. I know as we're thinking about our summer plans and we have relatives come visit us, we say, boy, maybe we got to get out in June or July because by August we're probably going to be breathing a lot of smoke. And it's ridiculous. We look at the standing dead timber. Over 5 million acres of our national forest has been declared as acres that could be using treatment here for diseased or dying timber that you can salvage after a couple of years because you actually can log it and turn it into to saleable lumber. The bottom line is this: we need comprehensive forest management reform. This will improve the health of our forest. A managed forest is a healthier forest, and we create thousands of good-paying jobs. We provide economic certainty for Montanans. We create tax revenues. We have these counties in western Montana that are dying on the vine because they have the majority of the acreage in their counties is federal lands, public lands, and there's no tax base there. So we have to put in place things like secure rural schools and PILT, which is basically the federal government stepping in and writing checks to our counties because we've lost our natural resource base. So this reforms that we're pressing on right now. In fact, I've got a hearing coming up Thursday on a bill that moves us in this direction. A managed forest is a healthier forest. It reduces the risk, the amount of smoke we breathe in the with wildfires in the summertime, but it also has economic advantages in bringing these jobs back. When I was a kid in Montana, we had 30 active sawmills. Today we have 11. You remember up in Lincoln County,
right,
the famous Lincoln Loggers, Libby Loggers in
right,
Lincoln County. Lincoln Loggers, I'm playing with Lincoln Loggers.
I was
Libby
a Lincoln
Loggers,
Logger when I was 7.
Yeah, but the Lincoln Loggers is something the kids don't know about anymore. We got to bring Lincoln Loggers back. But this is Libby Loggers, right? You see, I get these kids back here in my office with Libby Loggers Letterman's jackets on, and it's a crying shame. Lincoln County is surrounded with these forests. There's no mills in Lincoln County. In fact, the joke, and it's a sad joke, is that they should rename the Libby Loggers and call them the Libby Lawyers.
Wow.
Because it's the extreme environmentalists,
right,
lawyers that are making all the money now shutting down the timber industry, and it's a true tragedy in Montana.
Tell you what, let's try to get a caller in real quick. Harry, you're on with Senator Daines. Quickly.
Yeah, good morning. I know being a state senator, you emphasis on the state, but this is national land. It's not Montana land. It's not. I'm from Montana. I was born in Montana. My family is born here. But it's not Montana land. It's national land. So our voice really, I mean, it's just because we live near it doesn't mean it's everybody's land. It's Florida's land. People who live in Florida, they own that land. So, I mean, we can push to put our point of view, but it's a national land. And also this clean coal business, that's nice rhetoric, but there is no such thing as clean coal. It's like saying a healthy hepatitis. I mean, even if you get everything out of it, scrub all the pollution out of it, yet that's still got to go somewhere. There's big piles of that slag hanging everywhere, and it blows around, and it's no such thing as healthy. You've got to tear the land.
Harry, thanks for your call. We'll get a response.
Let him answer. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, well, a couple things. I respectfully disagree. There is outstanding clean coal technology that can be developed here that will provide us a reliable, cost-effective, environmentally sound way of continuing to use coal as part of our energy portfolio. So I just respectfully disagree. It is there, and it needs to be developed, but we can get there. Number two, it relates to our national forest. While it's true it is our national forest, they are mismanaged. And there's a principle that I believe in that Montanans embrace, and that is the people who are closest to the lands should have a louder voice in the management of those lands. One of my favorite show and tell pictures I have in my office here in Washington, D.C., is a picture of a gray, dead, sick, dying forest. And you see the section line, the fence running right through the middle of that forest. On the left-hand side is this dead, dying forest. On the right-hand side is this green, vibrant forest. What's the difference? Left-hand side, federal lands. Right-hand side, state lands. Our state does a much better job of managing its forest than the federal government does. So why don't we allow better forest management practices on our federal lands? We don't have to get in a discussion right now of who should control the lands in terms of the deed. Let's have a discussion about how we can better manage the lands. And I think the way we're managing our federal lands in Montana could use huge improvement, and we can do a better job as Montanans than a bunch of federal bureaucrats in Washington, D.C.
Got time for one more quick question?
You bet.
Let's get Rick on the line. Rick, real quickly, what's your question for Senator Daines?
Mr. Daines, I am an extinct forester from the federal government. The property around here has either been logged or burned at least once. There is no old-growth forest left. And when people try to manage it as an old-growth forest, they need to realize when it was cut or burned, was replanted in a manner so it would be overstocked, and every 10 years you can go return to that area and take some trees out. It's already been designed to be logged.
Okay, Rick, thanks for the call. So,
well, Rick, thanks. That sounds like a voice of wisdom here, cutting through the clutter of chaos. It's so true. Our national forests are renewable resources. There's growth going on all the time, and they have to be managed. And that's what we're looking for, is common sense sound practices. Gone are the days of clear cutting. We're not talking about that. We're talking about modern forestry practices that are thinning, that are reducing some of the fuel loads and so forth that create the flashpoint for wildfires. So, by the way, the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, headquartered right there in Missoula, they've been great allies for us in this fight to put in common sense forest reforms. Because guess what? A healthier forest reduces the risk of wildfire. It creates jobs. It creates tax revenues. But you know what? It also creates better habitat for elk and for our wildlife. So it all ties together. The reality is about 80% of Montanans believe we need to have good common sense forest management practices. It's some of the extreme environmental groups that step in and file lawsuits here and stop that progress. That's where the battle needs to stay focused on. Is let's stop these extreme environmental groups from preventing sound management of our forests in Montana, and bring together. It's the sportsman groups, many sound conservation groups, as well as the timber industry, working together. We're collaborating to do the right thing for our forest. Let's stop these extreme environmental groups. That's where a lot of the problem lies.
Okay, real quick, in like less than a minute, how are we doing with working against ISIS?
Well, obviously what happened in Orlando was another terrorist attack. It was inspired by Islamic extremist ideologies. It was carried out in a horrific manner. Let's not forget where we need to place the focus. The threat at hand is radical Islamic ideology that is inspiring these homegrown attacks now in the United States. Mr. Mateen was born in the United States. This isn't somebody that came from Syria or Iraq. This guy was a U.S. citizen. What we saw happen in Orlando is what we are seeing happening now in Europe, in Brussels, in Paris. These are homegrown terrorists that have a radical Islamic ideology. They must be eradicated. They must be tracked down. They must be taken off the streets. That's where the focus needs to reside. This whole gun control debate, it comes up every time there's some kind of a shooting. The bottom line is it would have not have stopped what happened in Orlando. It's not stopping what's happened in Paris and in Brussels that have very, very strict gun laws. The bottom line is if Mr. Mateen would have been stopped from buying a gun, he would have found a gun somewhere else or a bomb somewhere else and created his act of terror. That's where the focus needs to remain. We need to continue to stand up and protect the Second Amendment rights of the people of Montana.
And Senator, please, let's stop calling this lone wolf attacks. These attacks do not happen in a bubble. There are support systems, whether it's parental, whether it's mosque, or whether it's any number of different types of entities. They are not acting in a singular fashion.
Well, correct. And we should never let a known terrorist buy a gun or a known terrorist board a plane. That's common sense. But the bottom line, as it relates to this battle, is that we can be thankful that we have members of our law enforcement and the U.S. military who are on the offense. We've got to go on the offense against radical Islam. We can't just sit back and play defense. We've got to go on the offense and go after these folks, track them down, take them off the streets. Frankly, Gitmo's got a lot of open vacancies right now. I think we can move a lot of those folks right down to Guantanamo Bay. There's vacancy down there.
Steve, it's been a pleasure always to have you on the show. You're welcome anytime, sir.
All right. Peter, John, thanks for your time.
Take care.
You bet.
All right. That's Senator Steve Daines. We're up against a break. We'll be right back.